Hello, and welcome back to the Stitchin' Addiction YouTube channel. I am so glad that you are here today, especially if you're here for virtual Jane Con. I'm excited to be presenting and discussing the topic of sister sister, how Jane Austen used her sister relationship as a trope in her novels. And I'm going to be discussing that here with Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Ayana?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Tiffany. For any of you watching who may not know, I'm Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook, the name of my blog, and my handle on all social media. I am a writer, fashion history enthusiast, and historical costumer. My main area of focus, like my handle probably gave you the hint for, is vintage style. So, 20th century, 1920s, kind of through 1970s ish. But I really, really adore Regency and Jane Austen's novels, her time, everything like that. And lately, I've been getting more and more into the historical side of things. And it's been such a joy to just kind of see that overlap of fashion and intrigue and social change that kind of gets reflected in her works and in the clothing.
Mhm. Definitely. Yes, it's all connected. It's all connected somehow.
So all those things have a really close interwoven relationship, and siblings, sisterhood, and family relationships also do in Jane Austen's work. So I'm so happy today to kind of discuss how the relationships in real life in Jane Austen's novels kind of reflect the relationships we have in real life with those who enjoy Jane Austen's novels, such as everything and everyone tuning in for virtual Jane Con now and other Jane Austen related events, of course. So, just like we have those close relationships with people who love the same things we do, we're going to go ahead and talk today about real life close relationships in Jane Austen's work.
Yes, Austen enjoyed close relationships, as Ayana mentioned, with all of her siblings, and specifically with Cassandra. So we started this research with the question, did this serve as a model for some of her well-known sister pairs throughout her major works? So let's look at what Jane and Cassandra's relationship was like. And for that, I looked a lot at the book My Dear Cassandra, which published selected letters of Austen's. And a lot of those letters are to Cassandra. It even says in the book that Jane sent journal letters to her sister almost twice a week, and that their relationship was so close and harmonious that it was almost like an extension of each other. I found that use of journal really interesting because we think of a journal as like a really private thing where you record like everything, all your thoughts and your feelings. And so to call these letters journal letters tells you how close the sisters were. I also found it interesting to see kind of like the roles that they each seemed to play in the sisterhood, because it seemed like they had those kind of stereotypical, I guess you would say, roles of the older sister, which Cassandra was the older, and the younger sister, because you have, Jane saying, I know you're going to scold me for this. And then you have Jane also saying, Cassandra, don't pinch your pennies too hard. You need to get a new dress. I got you this fabric. I know you're not going to be happy that I spent the money, but I got you this fabric because you really need this dress. So you kind of have this stereotypical responsible older sister that's keeping the younger one in line. And then you've got the younger one who has an incredible sense of humor. The more you read her works and the more you read her letters, the more you realize Jane's sense of humor was just incredible. And trying to get her sister to kind of loosen up and enjoy life and do these different things.
Jane is so funny in her letters, and I definitely see that elder sister syndrome with Cassandra. And I thought it was so beautiful how close they were and how okay with that closeness they were. It never feels forced. It feels very natural, and they seem to genuinely enjoy being each other's company.
Yeah, no, they definitely do. And Jane talks about, I have attained the true art of letter writing to be able to express on paper exactly what one would say to the same person by word of mouth. And so she's, actually expressing everything that she would say word for word to Cassandra in these letters, which is a really interesting kind of view into their relationship. And then, of course, you also have Jane asking fashion advice from Cassandra on a regular basis. There was even at one point when she was like, "Oh, Cassandra, I didn't take your advice. I went ahead and did the bonnet this way." And then she puts like a PS on the letter and is like, never mind, I thought about it and I changed it to the way that you suggested.
Yeah. No, I love the fashion advice that they kind of give each other over the years. I think that was a really interesting thing to read, that they didn't just talk about, their lives and what was kind of going on whenever they were separated. They talk a lot about fashion and clothing. And for me, that was a big point. I was kind of like, "Ooh, can I get some tips here?"
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, like my name suggests, I do primarily focus on 20th century fashion, like what most people think of as vintage, like 1920s onward. But the interesting thing about anything that's more thought of as historical is that you don't have photographs for reference. So I think any details about fashion and like what people were doing with their clothing and things like that were so interesting. And the two of them talk about it a lot.
They really do. And it just kind of goes to show their harmony in their relationship. Because even at one point, she refers to them collectively as we.
Yeah.
When she bought some muslin fabric for them, and she's like, in texture, the muslin is just what we prefer. This harmoniousness is also noticed by their nieces as their nieces get older, because you see the letters they write to their niece, or their nieces come and visit them. And Caroline even says their house was cheerful and harmonious. It was not their habit to argue with each other. And then when Jane wrote to one of their nieces, she was like, I've read the book that you were writing to your Aunt Cassandra in our own room at night while we undressed. So it just shows like how close and comfortable they were with each other. This closeness and this level of comfort with each other extended even until Jane's last years, when she was suffering from her illness, and then ultimately even until her death. Jane repeatedly talked about what a good nurse that Cassandra was to her. She talked about she was her dearest sister, her tender, watchful nurse, and Cassandra even traveled with her to the spa waters so that Jane could try to get some relief or maybe even get well. And then, of course, ultimately, Jane passed away in Cassandra's lap. For those last hours, Jane was struggling to breathe. And so Cassandra had put a pillow in her lap and supported Jane's head. And that's actually where Jane passed away. So, this level of comfort to even be that close when you're going through something like that health wise is just even more highlighted in those last days of Jane.
Yeah, I think it shows just how close they were, that even in death, they seemed almost to be one whole, two halves of a whole. And that's definitely repeated throughout, I would say, every single one of Jane's novels, whether for positive effect or negative. But we do see that over and over and over, their closeness in real life and then in fiction.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And then, of course, we have Cassandra's famous words that she wrote the day that Jane passed. She wrote them to one of their nieces, and she said, I've lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is if I lost a part of myself. So, just that, once again, that knitting of hearts, kind of like you said, the two halves of a whole, and how Cassandra just felt like she just lost part of herself when her sister passed away. So then, of course, like you said, it translates into the sister pairs that she writes about in her works.
For better or for worse, right? So, on that note, we do see that theme of sisterhood, very close sisterhood, over and over again in all of Jane's novels. Right now, we're just going to talk a little bit about her main works, not every single thing that she wrote. We want to first talk about how was sisterhood reflected positively, because there are some examples of where it is negative, but positively, how is that seen in her main novels? I think the one we got to talk about first is Pride and Prejudice. Everyone's like tried and true, like the first one that comes to mind. And obviously, Jane and Elizabeth, Lizzie Bennet, they are definitely the ones that I think mirror Jane and Cassandra the most. You definitely have that same like two halves of a whole. They seem to do everything together and kind of not, I don't want to say complete each other, but they really do seem to kind of be each other's complement, if that makes sense.
I definitely think that they're each other's complement. And it's kind of like we talked about with the almost stereotype older, younger sister of Cassandra and Jane. You once again see that a little bit with Jane and Elizabeth. It's a little bit different because you've got Jane is the one that actually has to be pushed a little bit, but you have that example of, Jane who is the shy, underconfident, but pretty sister. And then you've got Elizabeth, the outspoken, overconfident, as evidenced by her comebacks to Darcy, and very smart sister because, she was Mr. Bennet's favorite because he said she was the one that had the brains. And so you definitely once again have this two halves of a whole and how they complement each other. And yes, maybe not they're each other's perfect match because we have to leave that for Darcy and Bingley, but still a definite very strong sister pairing that very, very closely mirrors what Cassandra and Jane experienced with each other.
Definitely. I think that one really, it almost seems like autobiographical. When I was reading Pride and Prejudice, I was like, wait a minute, we've seen this before. So the one that I think is really positive as well is in Sense and Sensibility, everyone's other fave. You definitely have the sort of two halves of a whole again. You have, the sister that is kind of more reserved, and then in Eleanor, and then Marianne, the one who's more outspoken, more emotionally open, and stuff like that. But I do want to mention the whole theme of illness again running through. Like in Pride and Prejudice, Jane gets sick, and Lizzie is very upset with their mother for sending her out to go meet Mr. Bingley. And I think it's important to kind of remember back then, a cold wasn't always just a cold. So I think if we think about it that way, it does seem a little silly now. Like, oh, well, she just got a little cold. Like, it's not that bad. But keeping that thought in mind, I looked at it again and thought, oh my goodness, she's really worried about her sister. This is a real fear that people would have had back then, or it starts as a cold and then progressively gets worse. You have a fever and you die. And I think that's very telling given how, I mean, obviously Jane didn't know she would, Jane Austen, not Jane Bennet, have a short life, but it's very interesting to look at that and then also think about in real life that Jane did get very ill and die in her sister's arms. And then in Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie is very worried about Jane possibly undergoing, something similar, that she goes to Netherfield Park just to see that Jane is okay. So we do see that same thing again in Sense and Sensibility with Eleanor and Marianne when Marianne gets very sick, and there's a constant, I think, kind of undertone in all the novels, really, if you think about it. Don't get sick, don't get sick. So it's weird. It's like, did she know?
I think that is interesting because I realized when I was reading that part about Cassandra caring for Jane in that last year and a half, how well it mirrored Eleanor caring for Marianne in Sense and Sensibility. But I was like, Jane doesn't know that she's not going to live. She doesn't know that she's going to pass away so young and from this disease that they really didn't know what it was at the time. And so it's almost like it's prophetic. And it's like, was it prophetic? Like, was she really, kind of had an inkling? Or was that something that they were just a lot more in tune to and wrote about a lot more than just because, like you said, a cold wasn't always just a cold and germs were big and scary from your water. I mean, it's like the Brontes. They almost all passed away early because now they figured out they were drinking water that was contaminated from a burial ground right there. And so these things were very real and happened very regularly. So it's kind of like, was it prophetic? Part of us wants to say, oh, yes, it was prophetic. Jane is amazing. She knew all of these things. But on the other hand, it's like, maybe it was just kind of how they thought too. But it is very interesting because it's like she almost pre-wrote what happened at the end of her life when she wrote that, especially about Eleanor and Marianne, because Marianne's was life-threatening, and you got the older sister Eleanor taking care of the younger sister Marianne, just like you have with Cassandra and Jane at the end of Jane's life. So it's really interesting how she paints that picture of what sisterly love and sisterly relationships look like, even when someone is threatened with illness and death before her own happened.
I think that's really interesting that both novels, the illness represents a turning point. In Pride and Prejudice, the illness occurs at the beginning and it shows, okay, things are about to move along with romances that follow and stuff like that. It's when Lizzie gets a chance to know the Bingleys better, to know Darcy better, start that chain of events. And then in Sense and Sensibility, the illness happens further along. And it's when Marianne kind of has a change of heart and realizes, okay, maybe I have been kind of taking things to the extreme. How would life be if I were to change a little bit? And I think that's super interesting that, yeah, we get it at, at the beginning and then more towards the end and both, but they both represent a turning point.
That's actually a really interesting thought that I hadn't thought of. But yeah, that how she uses illness as a way to represent that turning point in her character's development.
I mean, then again, like we could say, yes, Jane is a brilliant genius and she figured out all of this. Look at how she uses illness. But also, yes, it could just be, in a time before germ theory, it's just a constant fear that everyone always has because you don't know. So who knows? We also see something interesting in, if we move along to a different novel, in Emma, you see non-biological sisterhood. It's interesting because I think Emma she has a biological sister, and she's not really, that relationship is not really dealt with in much of the book. And you kind of forget almost, and in most movie iterations, they either cut out the sister entirely or just relegate her to kind of a side character. The real sisterhood in Emma is Mrs. Weston, formerly Miss Taylor, Emma's governess, and then Harriet Smith. And it's interesting because you get with Mrs. Weston being marrying Mr. Weston, she leaves Emma's life. And it seems that up until that point, they had a very positive relationship, even though she was much older, even though she was technically her employee. It seems like they did genuinely grow quite close. And even though Mr. Knightley kind of mocks Emma and says, well, you never really paid much attention to her anyway. You always kind of did your own thing and thought you knew best. She does seem to appreciate and welcome Mrs. Weston's attempts to improve her. She appreciates everything that she's done. She never thinks of it as, well, she tried to change me too much or she was always being very bossy. She seems to very much be okay with it and think, oh, it's all for the best. I wish I had listened more. I wish I had done more. When she leaves, Emma really feels that loss, that relationship so keenly. She literally goes out and finds it with someone else. I think that's so interesting that, yeah, she goes, sort of brings home Harriet one day, figuratively. And it's kind of like, yeah, well, I remember how Mrs. Weston was so great to me and so, kind and genuinely wanted to make me a better person. I'm going to give that gift to someone else without asking if they want it or not. So, sisterhood by force, maybe.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting you mentioned that because you literally go from chapter 1, of course, when Miss Weston gets married, or Miss Taylor gets married and becomes Miss Weston, and in that, right at the beginning, like in the first couple paragraphs of Emma, it talks about how even though technically Miss Taylor was her governess, which, as you mentioned, would have made technically Emma would have been Miss Taylor's employer, they were actually sisters in the way they acted toward each other. And then, yes, it's literally chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3. So we literally have 2 chapters, and then she goes and finds Harriet. So, yes, very quickly, all of a sudden, she's like, and even when it says she goes to find Harriet, she's like, she doesn't actually go to find her. Miss Goddard is like, I'm going to bring this girl along to visit. And Emma was very pleased because she had noticed Harriet before and had wanted to take an interest in her because she was very pretty. Of course, that's why Emma was struck by her. And so it's interesting. It really literally just takes like probably a matter of days or weeks before she's substituted in. Okay, now I'm going to bring in a younger sister here.
The idea of getting close to her own biological sister is like seemingly not on the table. And neither is being alone. I thought that was very interesting too. She's like, well, I can't just hang out by myself with my dad. It's like, you could have, though. That's an idea. But yeah, she immediately replaces her. I thought that was interesting.
I think this is kind of a side note. What I was really struck with when I read Emma as a book was it's almost like her dad made her an equal. Basically, he emotionally leans on her for too much for her being the age that she is and being his youngest daughter. And so it's almost like she had to find her identity in that. That was kind of forced on her. And I know that, yes, that's, I'm using 21st century speak here, as far as like, a parent shouldn't do that to a child, but still, it's almost like she had that identity and that position forced on her at a relatively young age when her mother passed away. And it doesn't seem like Isabella was interested in helping out with their dad or anything. And so then she kind of finds that identity. It's like she needs to find somebody to help with as well. Like she just has to help people because that identity was forced on her so young. Now it's just become who she is. She can't rely on people. Instead, she has to help them.
That's a really good point too. And I wonder if, again, to kind of lean into 21st century too much, the having the role as, yes, an equal, but also kind of a caregiver, because her dad like can physically do for himself, right? But he's always, worried about, is it too cold? Is it too hot? Should we leave? Oh no, no, we couldn't possibly leave. You know what I mean? So she's very much like emotionally catering to him. And one does wonder if that's why Isabella was so keen to get married and leave the house. Separate story. Maybe we need that like prequel. But you wonder sort of if Emma felt like Mrs. Weston was her only real companion rather than someone she had to take care of. Because there were no other siblings in the house. Isabella was much older than her, and then she moves on and gets married, right? And you have her governess, they're together all the time, right? And you wonder if like that's the only chance she gets to have someone who she's not in a role where she has to do anything to do anything for her. She feels like she can be herself.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. And then she just goes on to make it all about what she's doing for others with Harriet and all her matchmaking. Really, then, that kind of comes to an end with Mr. Knightley, which we'll circle back to that later. Another sisterhood that we see in the novels, and this is one that is not talked about, I've never really heard this one talked about before, is Fanny in Mansfield Park. And I actually just recently finished doing the audiobook for this book, and so it's pretty fresh on my mind. And you have Fanny who's taken out of her home at a young age. She's like 9 or 10 years old. Her sisterhood with her new family with the Bertram sisters does not go very well. You wouldn't ever really say she builds any kind of sisterly relationship. She even just kind of plays along with Mary Crawford. It's not really a sisterhood on Fanny's side. But what's interesting is when Sir Bertram, comes up with the idea to send her back home to her Price family, she bonds with her sister Susan. And Susan's 14 when she goes back. And at first, Fanny is super annoyed by Susan. She's like, why are you doing these things and, being loud and all these different things? But then the longer she stays there at the Price home, she realizes Susan is actually a very sensitive child with a strong moral foundation. I think just like some people are born with more of like a justice idea in their head, I think that Susan was one of those kind of children. And what Fanny realizes is that Susan doesn't know how to speak out against the chaotic things going on at their home that she thinks aren't right. And so she does it in a very rough way. And it's very annoying and very grating and very loud, which Fanny doesn't like any of that. But once she realizes that, she takes Susan under her wing and starts to foster that relationship and foster those sensibilities in Susan and build her into a more socially acceptable woman, I guess is what you would say. And then ultimately gets her brought back to Mansfield Park. So when Sir Thomas has Fanny brought back, he also already knows through Fanny's letters that she's become really close to Susan. And so he said, can bring Susan with you if you would like. And so she does. She brings Susan. And the novel ends with Susan still living at Mansfield Park. From all appearances, Susan never goes back to the Price home. So I thought that was another really good example of sisterhood. Once again, you have an older sister who is helping a younger sister. I would say not so much a give and take on this one, maybe not so much that two sides of a whole that we've been talking about. This is more about an older sister seeing an opportunity to help a younger sister reach a different plateau. And so she does that. But it's still a really good example of sisterhood and kind of gives us a view into Jane's perspective on what sisterhood should look like and, what her and Cassandra would have done for each other in different situations, I feel like.
I think that's a really interesting point too about Fanny and Susan that you mentioned, that she at first balks but kind of takes her under her wing, and in fact that progresses throughout the novel. You see that again in Northanger Abbey with Tilney's sister, Eleanor Tilney. There we go. And so you have in the beginning, there's another sisterly relationship that we're going to get into later, but ultimately, Catherine Morland forms a genuine sisterhood with Miss Tilney, And it's interesting because it's almost as if Jane Austen couldn't imagine not having a sister for her heroine at all. It just it you could see her just writing and saying, well, of course someone has to have a sister. Of course, we're going to add that in there. And all of the love interests have sisters. And I know you could say, well, families were larger at that time. Of course there's going to be, but why don't they all have brothers? That's never a thing. Every single one, except I think maybe in Emma, Mr. Knightley, are any sisters mentioned? But then you have Isabella, Emma's sister, who's kind of in there. And I think it's funny that you in the one novel where there is no sister at all relegated, to that position, she creates one. So in Mansfield Park, we have the cousins, the Bertram cousins, who, yes, are no friend to Fanny. So Fanny kind of in the novel, she brings her own sister, right? In Emma, there's no close sister relationship. Emma brings in Harriet. Northanger Abbey, in that one, there a sisterhood is attempted, and then with Henry Tilney, he conveniently has a sister already, so that even if your sisterhood doesn't go well, guess what? You can try again. You can either bring one, create one, or marry a guy that has one. I thought that was really interesting in all of her novels. Conveniently, there is a sister, and a positive one at that, in all of them.
And I think it stems back to Jane's whole philosophy that you need to write what you know. Because when you read her older letters toward the end of her life, a lot of her nieces were writing. And she would read their documents and then give them feedback on it. And she would say, "You've never been here. Why are you trying to write about it? So and so wouldn't have done this because a good woman in that standing would not have done that. Or you've characterized her this way in this point, but you have characterized her differently by this action." And so she would give them all this feedback. And one of the things you see her repeatedly talking about is writing what she knows. She even argues with her publisher at one point about he wants her to write something. And she's like, "I don't know anything about that. I'm not good at writing that kind of thing. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stick to what I know." And so I think that it probably also kind of plays hand in hand with that idea that she wrote from what she knew. And she knew this sister relationship inside out. And so, like you said, there's backup sisters. There's not just sisters or sisterhood relationships. There's backup sisters. If you marry a guy, he conveniently has a sister, and then you still have the sisterhood. So yes, definitely. And some of those relationships are portrayed as negatively. Jane is also very honest about how sisterhood is not always pleasant, and it doesn't always bring good things in your life. And one of those, of course, going back to Pride and Prejudice, which we all know and love, is the whole relationship between Lydia and Kitty. And you have the idea that they encourage each other in bad decisions. They encourage each other in flirting with the officers, in doing things that they shouldn't do. And honestly, it's really interesting because once Lydia goes off and marries Mr. Wickham, Kitty seems to calm down a lot. Like, you don't really get that idea of Kitty being crazy anymore. And then we know that Jane told one of her family members that Kitty marries a preacher after the book. And so it's really interesting because you see once Lydia is out of Kitty's life, Kitty is actually capable of making some more level-headed decisions. And it's just that sisterhood together that creates such negative actions and behaviors and consequences for both of them.
That's a really good point. And something I noticed too, with that in mind about Kitty and later on, is I wonder if she's just one of those people who just kind of molds themselves to be more like who they're around. And I think growing up in that house would be a little lonely because Jane and Lizzie are just so tight. It's got to feel like, well, who do I hang out with? So obviously it's going to be Lydia, the, next closest in age and everything. And I think you have to wonder, once everyone moves out and gets married, it's just Kitty and Mary there. So you wonder if maybe she kind of is influenced by Mary more now that they're going to spend more time together. It really would have been just the two of them. That's really interesting. And you wonder if maybe like she, Mary's like, well, I'm going to read to you from the Bible. And Kitty's like, but after a while, maybe she got into it because she marries the preacher. I think, yeah, it's sort of showing how it can be very negative because she was perhaps under Lydia's influence and maybe a little bit neglected by Jane and Lizzie with their close bond. Maybe they didn't notice everything going on. classic middle child syndrome. And maybe now with Mary, she can just kind of be herself. It's just the two of them. There's no pressure. And yeah, it kind of calms down a little bit, tones down, and you never know. I think another thing with Pride and Prejudice that I thought was really interesting as a negative with Jane and Lizzie's friendship is that Charlotte Lucas is the one that kind of she's not critical of Jane, but she kind of calls her out and she's saying she's handling this badly. Okay, we all love Jane. She's so sweet, but listen, she's messing this up and it's going to be all her fault if she ends up missing out on this guy who likes her. She likes him. She's messing this up. Whereas everyone else was kind of like, oh, well, Jane, she'll figure it out. You know what I mean? They're kind of excusing her. Whereas Charlotte Lucas, not Lizzie, her bestie, is the one saying, no, Jane is messing this up. She's doing something badly. I know she's everyone's sweetheart, but I'm going to be the one to say, no, this is not one of those times where Jane is doing everything right. And I think that's kind of the opposite of what we've seen from a lot of the negative relationships are very obvious. You can tell that, yes, they're being a bad influence on each other or something like that. This one is more subtle, I think. I think it's Lizzie having that blind spot because they are so close, because their relationship is so positive most of the time. She's like, oh, Jane's such an angel. Nothing she could do would ever be wrong. If anything, she would handle it too well. And I love that Charlotte Lucas is the one that's like, yeah, no, she's messing this up terribly. She's going to end up single and alone like me. And you wonder if that's one of the things that made her think to jump for Mr. Collins. She's like, oh, I see what happens when a woman doesn't put herself out there. I'm not going to let that be me. And I think it's interesting that it is that blind spot that Lizzie has for Jane. And also, I think with Lydia, too, I would say a negative aspect of the whole relationship of the Bennett sisters as a whole is no one really kind of puts Lydia in check, really. There are a lot of little comments throughout the book saying, you shouldn't do that, you should da-da-da. But no one really, first of all, locks her up at home, which I think Lizzie does tell her father, and he's like, I can't do that. And she's kind of like, well, why not? With Mr. Bennett and Lydia, him saying, well, if she's going to act crazy, I'd rather she do it under, the eyes of someone we know. We'll never have any peace until she has exposed herself in society in some way, something to that effect. And you got to wonder if it's that same thing of, I love you so much. I don't want to believe the worst. Lizzie can see it. He can't. I mean, and that makes sense, right? That's his little girl. He's like, yeah, it won't be too bad. And Lizzie's like, no, whatever it is, it's going to be bad.
I mean, he does call them silly girls at one point, but I do agree. I don't think that he fully sees the extent of what could happen with Lydia and how it could really turn. I mean, Mr. Bennett likes to lock himself up in his library with his books. He doesn't really want to. He wants to escape. That's escapism at its finest. He wants to escape from, everything. I wish I could lock myself up in my library with my books. And we also see these negative relationships in Persuasion as well. And I know that you had made a really interesting parallel there.
Yes, I think that there were a few parallels between Anne Elliot and Mary Bennett that I thought stood out a little bit in Persuasion. It's really easy to see the two of them as being the same just because they are unmarried. They are sort of the ones that everyone forgets about. But their personalities aren't the same. I feel like Mary is much more withdrawn, and just by her own nature, I feel like she is more of an introvert, that the way we described it today. Anne is very vivacious, outgoing. She's talking to people and everything. I feel like her inwardness is pushed on her by other people around her, whereas Mary's is coming from herself. But it's interesting that everyone looks at Mary as if she's an Anne Elliot, and everyone looks at Anne as if she's a Mary Bennett, whereas they're kind of switched. I feel like Anne Elliot is more like Charlotte Lucas, where she just isn't given an opportunity to be herself, but she's really very comfortable doing things for herself, visiting, being social, stuff like that. And Mary Bennett is not. But there's this idea that if you are unmarried, you should be quiet, demure, make yourself useful, not get in anyone's way. And it's weird that Mary Bennett embodies that of her own volition, whereas Anne Elliot's constantly bucking against it in a quiet way, not in, the Dakota Johnson Persuasion movie, but in a much more quieter way she is. And she does that through her other relationships because her biological sisters are terrible, that it's extremely negative. Her sisters are the reason that she has to hide herself and make herself smaller to just still be accepted and still be out in society at all, because you kind of feel the whole novel that they're one step away from saying, and why don't you just stay at home with the children forever, indefinitely, till they're grown. And she seems very conscious of that as well. So she's always trying to like stay on their good sides. So there's definitely all this like, especially with Mary, right? Mary Musgrove, that she's just like, yes, Mary, of course, Mary, as you wish, Mary. You know what I mean? And because she knows with one word, these women will talk to the powerful men in their lives, her father or the husband, Mr. Musgrove, Charles Musgrove, and say, Anne is just so disrespectful to me. I don't think Anne is a good influence. I think that, she's ungrateful. I think that actual word we hear a lot in Mansfield Park about Fanny Price being ungrateful.
I think Miss Norris is the one that uses that because she's, brought her in to help her, even though she doesn't really help her. She won't let her live with her. She won't really do anything for her. She just brings her and gives her over to Sir Thomas. But yes, if she is in a critical mood, which is not uncommon, she will talk about Fanny. You're ungrateful and you're ungrateful for not accepting Mr. Crawford and you're ungrateful for this and you're ungrateful for that. So yes, that is a word that Miss Norris uses in relation to Fanny on a regular basis because she's supposed to be beholden to her for every last breath, apparently now.
Yeah, beholden. That's such a perfect word. There is that sense that she should be beholden to all these people. Look how kind we've been to you. Look, we never ask anything of you. Da 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 da. Right? These are her actual sisters telling her this. I mean, Anne Elliot, and you know, that's an awful relationship to have. But she manages to foster these wonderful relationships between the Musgrove sisters, even though they're kind of like I think a more quieter, subtler version of Lydia and Kitty Bennett. Not nearly as silly, but definitely that sense of a little more frivolous and stuff like that. And then you have it with Lady Russell, who is coming in as her mother figure, not quite sister, but still that sense of chosen family. And still showing, just in case we weren't sure, Jane Austen is showing, no, Anne Elliot is delightful. Don't believe what her sisters say. We're going to, in the next few chapters, we're going to find some pseudo sisters for her. Don't worry. I'm going to get you there, because there is this sense of, yes, if your biological sisters are not treating the heroine as she should be, the reward, as it were, that she'll receive in the end is a positive sisterly relationship, because she doesn't have that in the beginning.
Exactly. Yeah. No, Anne definitely. She probably, out of all of the heroines in Jane's novels, doesn't have the strongest sisterhood relationship, I would say, across the board. Like, she has the Musgrove girls that, like you said, she fosters, and then she has Lady Russell kind of as a mother figure. But compared to a lot of the other heroines, she never has a super, super strong sisterhood relationship to support her, even though she has those people that, serve as helpers along the way.
So I think that definitely ties in a little more to how we see chosen family, in addition to chosen sisterhood, I guess, in all of the main novels, that we've been talking about. We see it with more than just sisterhood, which I find fascinating because Jane Austen had so many siblings. Obviously, only one Cassandra, but still a lot of siblings, and how she shows that relationship in the novels as well. We did already talk a little bit about Emma and, how Mrs. Weston is sort of the original and Harriet is definitely brought in to replace her. But in the other novels, I think one that stood out to me was in Northanger Abbey. You have Catherine Morland, who is in Bath, I believe. When she first gets to Bath, she doesn't know anything, she doesn't know anyone. And Isabella Thorpe swoops in and she's just delighted with Catherine. She's like, oh my gosh, you're great. We're going to be best friends. And they start off very positively. And you think, oh, okay, here we go. Jane Austen again, giving us this pseudo sister where we don't have one. And it goes so badly. No spoilers if anyone at home has not read it, but it's not great. And there is a very keen sense of betrayal, I think, that Catherine feels at, someone who she thought was a sister And clearly Jane Austen is holding that relationship in very high regard, right? We see that over and over. That sisterhood is something to be cherished and is frequently a reward for a heroine at the end. She doesn't get that with Isabella Thorpe at all. It's definitely a come down. And we have all of the same elements though that make you the reader think that, okay, this is about to be the same thing we've had over and over. I'm excited. I want to see the sisterhood grow and flourish. And we see the taking a younger person under their wing. We have Isabella telling her, you have to be careful in Bath, watch out. Some people aren't, very honest. You want to be careful of those Tilneys. You may not want to hang out with them. All of these things. And you think, oh, this is great. Someone's looking out for Catherine. She's in a new place where she doesn't know anything. This is wonderful. And then we have the closeness that comes from their families being pulled closer and closer together, not to get too many spoilers. But we see that that's very fake very quickly as the novel progresses. And it's kind of a double whammy. It's positive and negative, because at first we think, oh, this is wonderful. This is that same warm, loving sisterhood that we've seen so far. And then we find out definitely not. And it's crazy because she's so open and so fun and just full of life. And it's actually Eleanor Tilney, who is much more reserved, much more quiet, much more keeping to herself, that is the true sister, the more genuine one, the one that is someone that is trustworthy and, can be prevailed upon, and the one that Catherine deserves, right? Our Austen heroine always getting what she deserves in the end. She gets a real sister because Isabella Thorpe doesn't count. We were all fooled. So.
Exactly. Well, and what I find really interesting about Catherine's story is I didn't mark an exact quote for this, but I strongly remember this from reading the book, that she had sisters at home before she went to Bath. And it seemed like from the book that they had a good relationship. It doesn't really talk about her doing a lot of letter writing or different things as the novel progresses. But it's interesting because it seems like she had that. She kind of knew what it was, but then she's completely kind of like Fanny Price in a sense, taken out of what she knows, her country life, into this more of a city life and this higher social circle. And she kind of has to relearn it all over again. And because she is naive in the social circle, not because she's naive as far as sisters are concerned, but because she's naive in the social circle, she kind of gets taken by Isabella and before she actually is able to move on to that real sisterhood with Eleanor.
I think that's a really good point that, yeah, she's not naive in the ways of sisterhood. She's more naive in the ways of sort of the world at large, from coming from a country setting and stuff like that, where everyone knows everyone. And then she's in, it's that fish out of water. She's in the big city and, doesn't really know. I think it's interesting too, that coming from a very positive home environment, she meets Isabella and is immediately like, oh, great, I know what this is. This is a close, loving sisterhood relationship. And, finds out, no, not necessarily.
She's just using her. Ultimately, no more spoilers. That's it. I'll stop saying anything.
I think another thing that's interesting to branch out a little bit is Emma and Mr. Knightley in the novel Emma. Their relationship is quite sibling-ish for most of the novel, if you really think about it. And a lot of people have commented on this time and time again, of course. In the modern adaptation of Clueless, I think they even make them siblings. No, they're step-siblings. Okay. And it's sort of showing again that positive relationship that you can have, that you should have. Like Jane Austen's clearly putting her own feelings into it, writing what she knows, right? She was very close to not all of her brothers, I don't believe, but at least more than one, to the point where you could say, okay, for the most part, she did. And you see that with Emma, and you see it change after the picnic at Box Hill. That's really the turning point there for their relationship. And a lot of people have commented on it saying, especially because of that age gap with the two of them, oh boy, is it too much of a fatherly type of thing? Is he talking down to her, being condescending? And I think not. I think it's because he started feeling their relationship change. He started looking at her as not a sibling, not a sister. And it's the picnic that makes him think differently. We all see, I think, our siblings' flaws way more than anybody else. We'll be the first ones to say, no. And in a way that we sort of ignore the flaws of someone that we're in love with, at least, at the beginning when everything's in the, rose colored glasses phase, right? So I think he was starting to feel that way with her. And then the picnic kind of makes him think, oh, no, 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 this is the same bratty Emma, my little annoying sister. No, 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 this is not someone who's a love interest. And I think that is a turning point for him. And of course, the novel goes on from there to, go in a bunch of different directions. But I do think that's interesting that up until that point, the novel reads like they're siblings. They seem to feel as if they're almost siblings. They're siblings in law, technically. Take that for what you will, but it does have a shifting point with the picnic, and then again at the ball, of course. But I think that there's a clear point that says no, we're not siblings. Shows just how close they were before then, and I think it's interesting that Jane Austen didn't think that was enough. You know what I mean? That no, we need to have a sister for Emma. She does have this very close relationship with Mr. Knightley, and that's wonderful. We're going to talk a lot about that. They're always bickering with each other. They're hanging out a lot, especially once Mrs. Weston leaves and gets married. But Jane Austen wants to make it quite clear we can't just have a brother. We need more. We need more for Emma.
Yeah, definitely see that sisterhood idea again, that it's necessary and important to have that sisterhood relationship. And I think you mentioned at one point, not in the video, another time, about how women didn't really have those close relationships unless they did have a sister or a sisterhood like relationship because of just the way that, everything was built, especially the country kind of life that Jane Austen lived and was talking about. You had a relatively small circle of people and you regularly visited the same people. What was it that Miss Bennet says? We have 4 and 20 families in our circle. 24 families, that's all you've got. I know she's bragging at that point, but to our world today, that sounds so small. But still, like the men were doing their men thing and, going off and playing their games and smoking their cigars and drinking their brandy or whatever, and so you had women that needed these supportive sisterhood relationships in order to have some support there in everyday life.
Yeah, yeah. Men get to go out into the world and do things in Austen's world during her time. In even the novels, men are always going off to London or something like that. Even in just if we look at Emma, Mr. Knightley goes to visit his brother to ask a question. If we remember that whole set of hijinks at the end, Mr. Elton goes to London to get the painting of Harry framed. And it's so taken for granted that men will go and do things and everything, that everyone's so surprised by Emma's father. And she's talking about, oh, we don't go anywhere. My father, he couldn't possibly. And they're like, what? A man that doesn't go anywhere? Because it's so taken for granted that, of course, men leave, women stay home, right? So I think even with that chosen family of her taking Mr. Knightley as who he was in the beginning as a sibling, and then it progresses to something more. That isn't enough for Emma, and the novel makes that quite clear. She's got money, she's got good looks, everyone adores her. She still needs someone, and that someone really being a sister, because it's not enough in that world to just have everything because you don't have anything else to do as a woman of the gentry. It's not really appropriate for you to go somewhere. And Elliot in Persuasion, they spent a lot of time, Captain Wentworth at the dinner when he first comes back, talking on and on about, oh, I would never bring my wife to sea. Nope, couldn't do it. Because yes, women aren't supposed to leave in that time. So yeah, I think it's interesting that Jane Austen sort of makes that distinction of, yes, well, women don't get to go anywhere, but we have these very close bonds with our sisters, whether they are biological or chosen. And that is so gratifying that it almost makes up for that. Jane Austen didn't go, I think, very far. I don't think she left England at all in her own life.
I don't think so. I don't remember that at all. So yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas her brothers, I know, they did their tours and different things. And so once again, you see that writing about what she knows, while, making a social commentary at the same time, because she's, obviously clearly showing that difference in her own little revolting way so that you can see that she doesn't always agree with it. And it's interesting because modern day adaptions and works have kind of carried on this sisterhood idea into, for example, you have Sanditon that just finished the last season recently. And if you read the original 12 chapters that Jane Austen wrote, there is a Charlotte Haywood and there is Georgiana Lamb. But the relationship that you see in the PBS masterpiece production is not really shown in those first 12 chapters. And Jane Austen may well have planned for it to go there. We don't know, obviously, what she was going to choose to do with that. But it's really interesting that the producer, the writer, saw this and was like, okay, she has sisterhood in all of her novels. So it's a safe bet to put in a really strong chosen sisterhood here and really build the entire series around that sisterhood that Charlotte and Georgiana share, and that idea of, we can be the writers of our own destiny, whether it's really actually possible based on your circumstances or not, but this idea that they want to try to do that and they connect over that and really support each other through the decisions that they have to make as a result of them trying to write their own destinies as women.
Yeah, I think Sanditon is a really good example because it's unfinished. And the first thing that, the showrunners did when they got their hands on it, the TV series, was throw in a sisterly relationship. And it feels very natural, I think, to have a close friendship, a close sisterly bond at some point. It does. It feels like every other Austen novel that we've read, every other adaptation, there's got to be some group of people, whether biologically related, two people, not group of people, whether biologically related or not, that have a close relationship that is genuine, free of artifice, and, just serves to help them along the way of whatever else comes. I thought that was a very smart decision on their part to make it feel more like Austen's work, whether it was going to go there or not. And I think you see it again in Clueless, because in this one, Cher, standing in for Emma, does have Dion. She has Dee as her best friend. And it's crazy because I guess the writers of that felt the same way. We can't have her not have a close relationship that is, you know, isn't fraught in any way, that we want one to have that's just very smooth. And their relationship is fine throughout the whole novel. It's everything going on with Josh, it's everything going on with Ty, the stand in for Harriet. Her and like Dion and Cher are totally good. They have no problems. They have, bickering and stuff like that. But we know their relationship is solid. We know that they're always going to be there for each other, right? Even when Ty kind of takes over as the popular girl, Dion doesn't stop being friends with Cher. That never happens. She just, becomes a little bit more interested in Ty. But there's never a point where Cher is alone and doesn't have anyone she feels like she can rely on. So I think to have that same closeness replicated again feels very Austen.
Definitely, and that's how they retain that idea even in those very modern adaptations. Because I mean, you could say Sanditon has a very modern flair to it as well. Like,
Yeah.
are they wearing Regency clothes? Is it set, in a Regency setting with Regency-esque building? Yes. But some of the ideas, that Charlotte's going to try to take control of her own destiny, given where she has come from, is much more modern, probably than even Austen would have written it. And so you do see it still carries through though, like you said, it still feels very Austen because they've chosen to center it on those strong sisterly relationships. And even in adaptations of her novels, I recently watched the 99 Mansfield Park, and it was interesting to me because instead of having Fanny and William's close relationship, and then Fanny eventually becoming close to Susan at the end, they merged that into one relationship. And so she was close to Susan throughout the entire thing. There was no William at all. And so she wrote all the letters were written to Susan, and it shows before Sir Thomas came to get her and Susan being really close at the Price home. And then, writing letters, and she would tell her stories. She would weave stories to write back to Susan back home. And then at the end, Susan does get to come live at Mansfield Park. And so I thought it was really interesting that in that adaptation, they chose to leave out that brotherly relationship and just completely substitute it with a sister relationship throughout the entire movie. They know that it's a safe play, I think. If they can play on these sister relationships, they've got something that their audience is going to love.
Yeah, I think so. It's sort of like if you had a recipe book or how to make something feel like Jane Austen. Let's throw in some sisterhood. Let's throw in some chosen family. Let's throw in, a guy with like a secret. We're not really sure what's going on. Let's throw in a really hot guy who's actually no good. Like, these are all the ingredients we need. And I think, yeah, some of the modern adaptations do it really well because, yeah, it all does feel very genuine.
Just like all of these modern day adaptations have their take on sisterhood in Jane Austen's works, we would love to hear what your take is on Jane Austen's thoughts on sisterhood and how sisterhood is represented in her works and even in modern day adaptations, whether it's a film production or a fan fiction novel or a work that they finished like Sanditon. We would love to hear your thoughts about any of those or your recommendations for any of those in the chat or in the comments below if you're watching this after this has premiered. We are so glad that you joined us today to listen to us talk about one of our favorite things. We actually connected over Austen's work and Regency fashion and all of those fun things. So she's still connecting all of us today, as is evidenced by the fact that you're here watching for Virtual JaneCon as well. She's still connecting people in those relationships today.
So if you enjoyed this conversation, definitely put your own thoughts in the chat and comments. Everything that we do on the internet or in other spaces, all of our work, Tiffany's shop, Stitch and Addiction, will all be linked in the description box below, as well as information on what we're wearing, just saying. So definitely check the description box below for more information, as well as link to the playlist for Virtual JaneCon this year, so you can watch the videos by all the other amazing presenters. We want to thank Virtual JaneCon for giving us the opportunity to be here, and thank everyone on the team for all their hard work.
Definitely. And thank you again so much for being here. And I'll see you next time.